marches that brought together, we did a march called the Children and Families March that was led by the children of domestic workers and the children that they care for. One of the domestic workers' Bill of Rights, and they carried signs that said, respect my mom and respect my nanny, and I think that what we tried to do was create a campaign that everybody could identify with. We made it a campaign about, I mean, the thing that we realized early on was that in a campaign for human dignity, there's really no such thing as an unlikely ally, right? Depending on how you frame the campaign and how you do your organizing. And we found that talking about respect, talking about reversing a legacy 7 decades long of exclusion and discrimination, talking about recognizing the work and valuing the work that makes all other work possible. Like, these messages people could identify with in different ways, and it allowed for lots of different people to get involved and feel their place in the campaign. So I think that's what I thought.
I think one thing that we share, both, an issue that I think both, domestic workers and taxi workers have to take on is there's an increasingly attempt to have us be not seen as workers, right? And so, like, I remember, like, some of the opponents for the bill, they would just try to say, oh, well, what about, like my kid babysits, and right, to kind of make. And similarly, like with us, it'll be like, oh, well, the only people that drive taxis are really, actors in between jobs, right? And there's a real kind of attempt, and at the same time, though, when they want to attack us, it's, well, we want to professionalize these people, Right. So there's nothing about, kind of making, recognizing that it is a profession for a large segment of people, right? And instead kind of problematizing that it's the people that have made it a profession that have somehow unprofessionalized it. So, and I feel like that's something in common. So I think one important argument, like the reason we call ourselves a Taxi Workers Alliance and not taxi drivers, is that we're workers. And even in all of our negotiations, especially economic negotiations, we've made it clear, okay, so what, we don't earn wages, but that doesn't mean we can't have a livable income. Okay, no one guarantees us health care, but you can't prohibit it either. And so I think, that's been a really important approach that we always take, and we're constantly trying to raise the consciousness among the regulators and the public, because actually the bosses get we're workers. They just don't give a shit about it. They actually. With the regulators and the general public, we're constantly trying to make that argument. Like when the cell phone rules came out, we're like it has to be hands-free, right? But for taxis, they banned it. Even if it's hands-free, you're not supposed to be able to use a cell phone. And we kept arguing. Like the Times editorial board just hates us, and I realized that's because if the Times editorial board has to contend with you as their potential employee, then the liberal in them says, yes, we should be good, right? But if they have to contend with you as someone who's serving you as as them being the consumer, then no, that consumer is always right. And so it's actually it's more, I think it's a lot of the kind of the neoliberals, whether it's among these editorial boards or among the regulators. I mean, for years we finally got somebody from the TLC who was willing to negotiate with us, and this is because we kept threatening a strike, and Bloomberg knew we were capable, you know, this was even before, this was in 2003. We were in the media literally like once a week for an entire 6-month period on a living wage campaign. We got Bloomberg to say taxi drivers deserve a living wage. It was hysterical, actually. Sometimes it's so tragic, it's comedy, right? But so his lead negotiator was like, no, yeah, we want to talk to you about it. We get that the fact that we regulate the meter and we regulate the maximum lease cap means we control your incomes. And when we kept saying to him, but we should be entitled to a living wage and this is the cost of living and so on. So they kept saying, yeah, but okay, if you earn too little, you have a choice. You can get another job. And I mean, look, they just kept saying it over and over again, and so, that notion somehow that, and I know that had we not been a predominantly immigrant and people of color workforce, the idea that you are entitled, the idea that job security is a fundamental worker right, it just wouldn't get questioned to the degree. Right. And I'm not saying it would, at the end, money is money, protects itself, but the certain nuances are absolutely affected by, race and immigration and class. So for us, it's been constantly making that argument that, look, we're workers, we're entitled to the same standards that other workers are. We are people that without us, all right, you've got your fancy $870,000 medallion and 13,000 taxis serving 1 million people a day. Great, good luck, because without us, you ain't doing shit. And that's the main argument. You need us. We may need you to implement what we're looking for, but at the end of the day, you need us more than we need you. But the only way you can sell that argument is if you're able to organize the workers, and the workers are militant enough to lay that bet on the line.
See, I think your question, Bertel, speaks to sort of the larger question of what has the labor movement done in the past that has been most successful? How has it sort of framed its arguments in a way to sort of allow it to sort of speak for something more than just the sort of the particular identity of the workers in the workplace? And I think if you think about the two examples, the key is the labor movement and the constituent parts of it needs to speak for something larger than the particular industry that they're representing. Right. So in the history of the labor movement, we have the notion of a weekend and an 8-hour working day in large measure because the organized labor movement raised those as fundamental questions. Right. And we didn't get a 40-hour week and an 8-hour day until the 1930s, but that struggle goes back all the way deep into the 19th century. So the labor movement, when it speaks for Social Security or employment insurance or something larger, it has always been more successful. The problem has been that we've sort of narrowed the scope of what we talk about.
Yeah, I mean, one thread, and the thing I'm kind of lucky in a sense because I get to learn from them without having to deal with the day-to-day. So I don't have the pressure. I mean, I've seen both of these two in periods where their brain was like on freeze lock. They were so exhausted. But these organizations are very nimble and in their tactics and very clear about where they're going in any given moment. And the thing that's interesting about the unions at this point are very unclear about where they're going and very locked into the way they've always done things. I mean, the standard answer at the highest echelons of the labor movement at this point are, we've never done that before.
And that's scary.
And that becomes a reason, and that's a reason not to do something. It's a thread that runs through every worker center I've ever met or every community-based organization that's fighting on worker issues or these, and there's two unions that I would consider that are real like unions dealing with a new economy. One is the taxi workers in the city. The other is the freelancers union, which really represents a middle strata group that's getting work but not jobs and dealing with all the implications of that. She has 90,000 members in this town. And people have to think about that. they are extremely creative in how they fight. You know, I thought Saul Nieves from 32BJ, the night they had the celebration and the awards after the bill was passed for the domestic workers, pointed something out. He said, you know, our union does these kinds of legislative campaigns all the time with 16 staffers and $1 million. And, you know, I'm up in Albany one day, the snow is coming down, and who's up there? 5 domestic workers and 1 very part-time staff person. Slogging through, you know, getting there, getting it done. And it's interesting to me, we are hidebound by our resources because we protect them. And what we need to do is put them into arenas like these, where people are ready, willing, and able to fight, and what they really need is resource. And I think that probably the most important thing that could be done right now is done what was done at the time of that merger of the AFL-CIO for the public sector, ante up. Put the money on the table and let the people that know how to organize in this period organize. What comes out of it, I think will be a new working class movement with some new forms of organization and some that look like the old forms. But this is a period where capital's changed the structures, the rules. We need new organizational types, and we're finding them. There's no more isolated worker anywhere than a domestic worker. And yet, they've created a sense of group, a culture, and now a possibility. It's extraordinary work in a period like this. And we should think about that.
It's also built on this notion of collective bargaining and the idea that you have sort of a formal contract, and so what you need labor officials to do is negotiate. You need lawyers to negotiate the contract and adjudicate how the contract is enforced. And these are showing a very different, these two examples and the freelance workers are showing a very different model that isn't tied to sort of the old sort of labor contract regime that does ironically trace its roots to the National Labor Relations Act.
And to your point about bargaining of a new type.
New type of bargaining.
Can I come back briefly on that? Because there's something that comes prior to this wonderful series of steps which were taken, and what comes prior is having a certain commitment from the people who do that kind of work to act in ways that workers doing other kinds of work apparently have not committed themselves, but not given to, and created a kind of collectivity which could engage in such actions. So I guess part of my question was, how did you manage to get a commitment from so many workers who don't work together in the same place? Because traditionally it's thought that if workers work, they see each other, they know each other, and it's easier to get that kind of commitment to engage in such tactics. But you've gotten that commitment from people who are working mostly separately, alone. How did you get them to see themselves, to have that kind of consciousness of themselves as being that kind of worker, which could create a real force through the tactics you mentioned if they got together as a group? How did that happen? That's what I find so surprising. How did that happen?
Yes, in different parks and different communities. I mean, wherever there's oppression, there's resistance, and a lot of the workers come from countries where there are very vibrant, powerful labor movements. And so I think when we first started talking about coming together, it was very, for a lot of workers, it was a little bit like, where have you been? Where have you been all my life? And a little bit like, we've needed a union forever, and let's make it happen. And so, there's a lot of different factors, but once people started coming together, the breaking of isolation and the sharing of stories and the collectivity and the space that gets created among workers is so powerful that then it really spreads. And I remember the very for a long time, it was very difficult to get 10 women in a room together, but then we reached this moment where all of a sudden you'd hand out 10 flyers and 50 people would show up, and it took on a life of its own because the need was so great and the workers wanted it so badly. So, I don't know if you want.
Yeah, I mean, very similar, and I mean, I would just add to it that I still think it is that sense of hope that ultimately brings people out, you know, that if people know what they need, they know what formation is going to bring them that power, what they're looking to see is whether or not there's a real possibility of a victory here, you know, things going somewhere. And yeah, and you know, ultimately it's from seeing your, you know, fellow workers, friends, neighbors who are willing to take that step forward. That is what brings people out ultimately. I mean, we started out, you know, 1998 with, you know, 0 membership. We now are almost at 15,000 registered members through the years. And we haven't done an organizing drive in a couple years. It's been mainly through word of mouth. I mean, we, within a year, we have about 10,000 members that go office visits within the course of a year. Most of our staff that used to spend like all our time out in the field, we're now just in the office because we have to answer to people, you know, coming in and calling. And, you know, it's like Ijin was saying, I mean, it's mainly from, you know, workers organizing each other. I mean, it was like how our strikes happened, you know. I mean, my favorite part of the strike organizing period was being able to, like, you know, when you're taking a break and you're just standing there and you see 2 cabs at a red light and they're both just trying to pass the same flyer to each other, you know. And we had so many moments like that. So, so I think now it's just become a matter. I mean, some of this is becoming difficult for us because with the economy, you have a whole new group of people coming in and getting out, and so some of the numbers are changing. After 2001, where you had a lot of Pakistanis just kind of, you know, really, you know, voluntarily left, but were essentially forced out because of the conditions, the level of racism that profiling that people were facing here. That changed our membership numbers overnight, you know, because, you know, we lost a lot of our members that way. So they moved. So I think that part of the, but now, like the Nepalese community and the West African community, they're newer communities now. And so we've been trying to do a lot more outreach to make sure that those communities are being represented within our membership. So, you know, I mean, you have to look at everything as a work in progress, and you have to get everybody to feel invested, that they see it equally as a work in progress. So, you know, people are constantly at work at it to build it.
I also wouldn't sell short the collective context of nannies in parks all over New York City and cab drivers at LaGuardia and Kennedy airports waiting for fares, standing around talking. I mean, those are the collective workspaces that we otherwise think of as individual workspaces, either the cab or the home they're working in, but there are places where people come together. And I guess the other piece that's striking to me is it's not accidental we have a transnational workforce in each of these 2 industries, and people come with very clear, well-developed ideas about organization, about justice, about equality that they then apply within whatever context they end up working. So that's a powerful thing to draw upon.
But don't get me wrong, I mean, it's really hard.
No. I don't want to romanticize it. No, I'm sure you're right.
I mean, to be clear, there's probably over 200,000 domestic workers, and Domestic Workers United, after 10 years of organizing, has 4,000 members.
Yeah.
We think that's huge, but it's a tiny fraction of the workforce, and the level of, you know, just, there is of course cynicism, and there's of course, I mean, it's difficult.
It's
hard.
2%, it's a small
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard out there.
Go ahead.
Because a few months ago, I saw this guy, Dorian Warren. He's a professor up at Columbia. And he spoke about the excluded workers from the Wagner Act and how it kind of allowed for this informal slave culture to perpetuate. And so labor now is kind of caught in its own noose because collective voice is kind of in this kind of box of what you can do, as opposed to workers not having that box.
Yeah, the piper
Where
gets
do you
paid.
see labor going? With egos kind of, we see people having egos and organizations at odds with each other, but also law is not on our side. And then EFCA, which was kind of crappy from the start, but we couldn't even pass that. So where do you see labor going with all of the laws kind of, we're at a glass ceiling and we're hitting ourselves in the head every time. How do you see us moving forward? It's not just that people sometimes can't say.
I want to just a couple of points, all right? This time last year, I got invited to Cornell to speak at a conference on organizing, and I walk in, I got a big sign up. Why is the atmosphere for organizing so toxic? I talk to these people a lot. They're organizing. And I said to these folks, they were all union people, I reject the question. They're not killing us. And they used to. When was the atmosphere for organizing in capitalism ever been any good? Right. Never.
Never.
We've only been legal a fraction of the time of the scheme of things.
They used to shoot us down in the streets.
We used to shoot us for this, and now they hire lawyers. And I admit, it's uncomfortable, and it's hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but the proof is in this. You can organize under any circumstances. You have to understand the moment you're in. It would help if you have a clear vision of where you want to go. Part of the problem with the unions, as I was trying to get at in my opening remarks, and I apologize if I wasn't clear, is that the unions have chosen in this very difficult last 30 years to defend what they have, which in a dynamic capitalism, which is going global and reinvesting and recreating itself, is a losing hand. Now, what will happen, in my view, some will continue to shrink and disappear. Some of that will be driven by changes in the economy. Some of that will be by their own inability to organize in their own industries. I will make a point. There are 2 unions in this city that organize retail workers. It is very hard to find significant victories that actually have involved workers. We get H&M by going over the top through the European corporate labor relations, pick up 1,000 H&M workers. But there's 500,000 unorganized retail workers in this town. And they're fighting over who's going to organize what. It's a big mistake. I don't want to be completely cold about this, but if an organization unwilling to adapt to the circumstances it's in is useless to workers or anybody else and deserves to disappear. And people in this room, we should not worry about that. New forms will emerge. And we should not be uncomfortable with that. The biggest failure of the U.S. labor leadership was for a protracted period. When everything was changing, they were uncomfortable engaging the new. The new is being engaged and other forms are being created. The scientist part of me, the observer part of me says, this is good. The other point, historical point, he could do this much better than I can. We have always trailed behind the development of capital. When capital was already at the post-Civil War period in monopoly forms, the labor movement was organized in local and intermittent forms. And they become national and permanent forms as they move through the 20th century. We catch up to their power for a brief moment, and we grow, poof, magnificently. And they keep fighting. And we circle the wagons, which is, in my view, is a losing strategy. The last thing, we have been uncomfortable developing a political instrument of our own. So capital has all of the political instruments. If this was a one-party country, we would understand it perfectly and know what to do. And I admit, I'm getting to this in my mature age. I have played the game and played it well. But the game is now rigged to a level that there's not enough space. And we're gonna need a more creative approach, and we're gonna need, well, I believe we're gonna need our own instrument. If we don't find either a political party or a political movement, it will be very, very difficult to consolidate anything in this period. I used to teach here and teach my students that you, like any socialist planner, every 5 years should ask yourself 2 questions. You want to be in a labor movement. 1, can I do this another 5 years? If you can't, get out. And 2, are unions still a viable, effective instrument for progress for workers? And if it comes up that they're not, move on, create something else. And we have to ask ourselves that question. I think this is a period where we take inventory and we really look at where we are and where we gotta go and try to learn. I mean, for me, I consider the work that I did in the last 7, 8 years the best and most important work I've ever been involved in, the work that was outside the unions. I mean, my affiliation with the taxi workers reinvigorated my spirit, and being around the domestic workers actually made me see that in this global economy, there are structures and new skill sets that workers will bring to the table, and they'll solve their problems. They'll fight back. And they fight back in very different ways. So I think this is, I'm totally depressed about the state of the union movement, but I'm absolutely enthused by the fact that there is this working class movement out there that you're not gonna read about in the front page of the New York Times, but when they get sprung on, Times is gonna have to make room on the front page, because it's gonna bust.
Unions and worker organizations are not the same thing. We've assumed they're the same thing for 100 and some odd years. And we made a bad bargain in 1935 when we accepted this corporatist model that the state would become the kind of neutral arbiter that would keep the forces, you know, between capital and labor in reasonable check. It didn't work out that way. And one of the reasons it didn't was all the excluded workers. To get that law passed, what the Roosevelt administration both had to do and was willing to do was give up completely on organizing black workers, agricultural workers in the South, and Latin American workers in the West and the Southwest. And that was a huge exception that we paid this, the labor movement has paid this enormous price for.
And some unions are becoming part of this, which is what they need to do. They need to get next to it, support, learn from it, and fund it. And, you know, the domestic workers, they lead this fight. They get some significant support from organized components of the union movement. But they made it easy for people to support them, which is something unions don't do. Unions, most union leaders' view of coalition politics is, here's my position, if you'd like to coalesce around it, feel free. They don't work like that.
Yeah, Ed, you were talking about a Labor Party or a new political formation.
I'm uncomfortable calling it a labor party, but yeah.
Or whatever. What I'm concerned about is that I see political mobilization from the working class in one way or another, from unions or whatever, every 2 years, every 4 years, and it goes straight into political work.
$200 million is the official number this year.
And I'm not,
It's actually a lot more.
Not that the unions shouldn't be involved in political mobilization.
Right, they have no choice.
But I don't see the mobilizations between that time. And of course, we know that without that kind of mobilizations, the political parties, whatever they are, even if they're a labor party, will screw you.
Okay,
So I mean,
I get the question.
Dynamic here
I get the question.
prevents mobilizations between and outside of the political movement.
Well, a couple of things. First off, just to my view, I think what we need at this point is the equivalent of a Chartist movement for the 21st century, because there is no civil control over capital. And we have to get there somehow. So we need a broad political movement that says we want to renegotiate the terms of how society is structured. Then we can create legalized forms within it. There is no tinkering with what's been there. It won't work. Secondly, we spent $200 million in this election. It sounds like a lot of money. $4 billion was spent on this election, mostly by corporate interests. Just, that's for perspective. Secondly, in the labor movement, in the best unions, and many of those unions will survive and go forward, we confuse participation with democracy. Mobilization is a code word for bring in some folks from central casting, hang signs on them, and bring them down to City Hall, or bring them to the polls on election day. There's no discussion at the base about what the political program of most unions should be. So this money is spent without real mobilization, without real participation, if you will. The point I was trying to make before about private sector workers gain certain skills, well, 71% of your members are in public sector unions in this city. Their skill set is lobbying and litigating. It's not direct confrontation. So that changed the character of the union movement in this city. And then you've got what's left of the building trades in the unionized sector, which is under enormous pressure right now. And they do certain things very well, but this is not their moment, because the market forces are even overtaking them in their strongest markets. So they can't compete. And part of that is the piper gets paid. It's a combination of reorganization of capital, 150 years of discrimination. Would they think people weren't working? People were getting skills. And for them, I couldn't get in the union. I'll take my 12 bucks an hour and no health care, but I'm working, and now they begin to rise. And frankly, and Ray Marshall is very good on this. Employers develop networks, just like anybody else. So if you've been working in a non-union construction worker, as you capitalize and recapitalize to get bigger, you stay with the workers that got you there. And they're beginning to work now on some of the biggest jobs in this city are going up non-union. From the same workers that were not allowed in the unions for many, many years. The piper gets paid. There's an element of that in that. So, but last, I don't want to call it a Labor Party. And this is what I learned from 2 attempts to be in the Labor Party. It will still be built on the political character of the unions if we call it a Labor Party. And that could be, I mean, the Jamaican Labor Party is a Labor Party in name only. The British Labor Party, they should give back the name.
Yeah, banned from using it.
And we would have this, and I believe we would have the same problem here. But that's why I call it a political instrument. I think it may be as broad as we got to have a whole new kind of political structure that gets control of this moment in history. I don't expect to be around to see it. But this is a fragment of a much longer time frame. We are going to have new forms. I'm not smart enough to know what they're going to look like. But we can't keep going like this. And you can look at our own government in Washington. It's rotten to the core. Corruption, which would be easily identifiable, is accepted. And
Is natural.
it's not gonna go. You know, I laugh when I read in the Times. I keep talking about the government in Afghanistan is corrupt. Holy shit! Really? You ever been to Albany? I mean, come on! It's a cash and carry business. You meet with somebody one day, and before you get home, there's a fundraising letter in your mailbox. How'd that happen? What's the message in that? Come on, it's very difficult. That's why this efforts are so remarkable. Yeah, I mean, these guys, there isn't a piece of their heart that hasn't been bought for 30 pieces of silver, and yet we can make them do the right thing on occasions. And that's the lesson. If you organize and you fight, you know, they want to survive themselves. They see it coming.
Maybe one more
I'm
question.
talking too much.
Yeah, when you're talking about the union movement, it's difficult, and what the leadership is thinking about and spending money on elections, it's difficult to believe they give a shit. 2 examples. Supposedly 200,000 emails went out on unemployment extension. There are 12.2 million union members with families and with friends and with neighbors. It would have been very different had 75 million emails gone out. And they could be signed up, and people could get used to sending off these emails. and have political power. And only 200,000 when you have, 12.2 million members. They don't give a shit if that's the result and that's what they're doing, even if they're spending money. It's sort of like bread and circuses. We've got our jobs and we've got our benefits and we do certain things for our members, but we don't really push the issues. We could win Africa if we do it. Bain only won his last election by 100,000 votes. It went online, and the median income in his district is $45,000. I bet you he voted for like the hedge fund guys only get,
I'm going to challenge you a little bit.
Right,
It's not a question of organization in politics. It's a question of ideology in politics.
And the other example is October 2nd. I went down, got friends, called it, let's go down. And the theme and the speeches, were unity, whatever it is, one America. And we really have massive class warfare, and they're planning to cut Medicare and Social Security and all, and exempt the rich from taxes further. And it's not mentioned. On the buses down, there was no attempts accepted formally on the bus by people like myself and other people to bring information on the issues. They're going to stick the particular bus that I was on, they're going to stick a movie, and then we got voted down. People were talking. No one wanted to watch some, Hollywood sitcom. I can't believe the leadership really gives a shit.
I believe they want to win. They don't know how, because they can't go to their own members. It's been too long. They don't know how to do it. It's a lot of different elements there, but in the end, you take EFCA, the movement that it would require to win something like that would mean you'd have to sever relationships in the political structure. They're afraid to do it. They're afraid to do it. They don't believe in the movement enough to run that risk. So essentially what's happening now is even our allies chip away at us. If you look at what happened with paid sick days in this city, with the domestic work, for years we had a bill with no opposition. There wasn't anybody who would stand up in the structure and say, we're opposed to this creation of a law that would allow domestic workers some minimum of protection. And we couldn't get a vote on it.
Yeah.
We couldn't get a vote on it. Look, I'm still enough of a Marxist to believe that, by the time you pass a law, all of the necessary conditions to codify that is already established. So and right now, you want to know why the tax laws suck? The tax laws suck because the workers' movement is weak. They've got all the power and they're writing it in their own favor. The organizing laws suck for workers because we're weak. If we organize, they give us the National Labor Relations Act. Why? To try to get control of the damn movement that made it necessary to have a law. They never wanted to give us a law.
They gave it, and they gave it for 12 years, and they took it away from.
And actually, by 1939, they were already changing the board and its mission. In the back.
We get a couple more.
I'm sorry, shut me.
A couple more, and then let's try to guess.
So it seems as though the Taxi Workers Alliance and also Domestic Workers United, that a lot of your efforts were pretty much tied to the local immigrant communities here, which I think is amazing, given that a lot of the people that, that your population represents are immigrants. Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, and South Asians, West Africans as I am, and I myself am a domestic worker from time to time when I need to be. And being West African, I've had my father and uncles have all worked as taxi workers, but of course, one class below yellow cabs, being gypsy cab drivers. So given that, I think that here in New York City, it's an interesting dynamic that's established in which the labor movement here, specific labor movements, are definitely tied to the immigration movement, or various immigration movements here in New York City, or various immigration communities, immigrant communities. And it's interesting to see that, despite various efforts to sort of pin immigration and labor against each other, immigrants are the reason for low wages or whatever paranoia there is out there about us. So it would be interesting to hear perhaps the historical context with regards to the relationship between immigration and labor, and also what the advances are, what the benefits are, and perhaps what the challenges are in terms of bringing these two sectors together and having them work together, despite the paranoia out there about immigrants and immigration reform.
Just to speak quickly about the history, it's an ugly history.
Yeah,
In the history of the American labor movement. And it ebbs and flows, so that there are moments when new immigrant groups are the essential groups that allow for the organization of workers, and yet organized labor at various points in American history has played a horrible anti-immigrant role, starting with the most progressive sort of institution of labor in the 19th century was not, of course, the American Federation of Labor, but the Knights of Labor, which had this stellar record of organizing black and white workers together, and yet had this viciously anti-Chinese attitude because they were opposed to Chinese immigrants coming and building the railroads and being in the way. So you've got this sort of organization that's very progressive around racial issues, black and white, but horrible around racial issues when it comes to people from Asia. And that replicates itself at various points in time in the labor movement and in particular places. But as a labor historian, I'm always struck that the balance, to my mind, always shifts in favor of immigrant workers coming into the United States as new workers and revivifying, revitalizing the labor movement at various points in its history. That's certainly true of the success of the CIO is built on immigrant workers, not just on sort of mainstream American workers. I mean, you know, you may have some other things to say about this in terms of, you know, the taxi workers in particular.
I mean, what I was actually thinking about was kind of the other side of the history, which is within the immigrant rights movement, there's a lot of classism, you know, and there's a lot of, you know, othering in the sense that there are those within the immigrant rights movement, for example, who just fundamentally don't believe in amnesty, right? See real differences between you know, immigrants that are documented and immigrants that are undocumented, and then look at means of, you know, people, you know, changing their status as really being tied to work, but it's usually kind of, you know, white collar or, you know, higher paying jobs. And so and we've seen that tension through the years, you know. I mean, there have been often times where, you know, we would have expected more support from the immigrant rights movement, you know, where we just didn't get it. So, I mean, like on May Day, right? May Day has, in this, I mean, the history of May Day is, of course, it comes out of the, you know, worker struggle. But, you know, over the past, you know, several years in this country, it's become kind of the day to really stand up for immigrant rights. And there's been this attempt, like locally, to try to really merge the two movements and have May Day actually be used as an occasion, you know, to both take the history of it as part the workers' history of it, as well as the contemporary history of it in terms of the, you know, the immigrant rights movement, and kind of merge the two and use that as a moment for unions to organize their base around immigrant rights, and secondly to mobilize immigrants more around, you know, kind of, you know, pro-labor, pro-union, right? And so we were part of an attempt, actually, we were both part of an attempt actually to try to merge the two coalitions. You just couldn't do it. People just didn't want to really come into that room. And, you know, we were in a really, and there were, for all sorts of reasons, I mean, some of it, quite frankly, were purely ideological, which to me were very dogmatic, you know, not like genuine ideological struggles. It was more about personality and really territory, but all coded around we're the more left, and any organization, including union, that has money is inherently corrupt, which I just think is so stupid, because these are workers' organizations, and we want workers' organizations to have money. We should have resources. That doesn't necessarily mean we're going to end up corrupt. So, but there were, there was this tension, and what ended up happening that was so interesting is, so the traditional May Day groups were not all immigrant groups, it's a different mixture of organizations. They had, their activity, and then the labor unions that came together had their activity, which started earlier, and it was at a different location. We happen to be at both, actually. And so, we're not going to choose. We need every movement on our side. We're not going to get into these stupid games. And so but at the union one in the morning, you had such a large, just large force that came out. And it was powerful. And it was the first time that the unions had organized it. I think a lot of us were thinking honestly, those of us even involved in it were thinking there's going to be maybe just a minor couple thousand at the most, maybe 2 if we get lucky. It was over 10,000 people.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Well, just to speak on that point, I was asked to write the flyer for that rally, and I wrote the flyer setting the context of the organization of May Day in 1886 as a struggle for the 8-hour day, and very much a struggle led by immigrant workers in places like Chicago, where you had new immigrants who took the lead, and radical, socialists and anarchists who were in the lead and sort of arguing for not only the 8-hour day, but the organization of all workers. And when I wrote the flyer, I wrote it with that context. And what would please me about the labor movement's response, whoever organized that rally, is they published it in Chinese, Spanish, and in English. And that, I thought, was the beginning of something that tried to sort of link those two movements in a very concrete way, leaving aside all the ideological struggles, whether it should be at Union Square or at Foley Square. I thought it had some very positive attitudes that tried to do just what you were saying, link the two movements, the immigrant rights movement and the labor rights movement.
If I could just add one other, which is a little bit of a different point, but one thing that I feel really strongly about, and we're a multi-ethnic organization, but actually the two communities that you named, both South Asians and West Africans, we have a large representation in our membership. And one thing that's really evident, within the immigrant rights movement, is you still, I think, non-Latino immigrant communities, at least here, we're just not able to mobilize at the mass level that, the Latino community has been able to. We still don't have that particular even language, I think, to talk about immigration. And I always say this because, I grew up here, and I remember as a kid, I didn't have a language on how to talk about racism. And I'd go back home and I'd want to explain to my parents if I'd been called a name and how that made me feel. And it wasn't until I started to study the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement that I had that language develop. And once that language develops, it changes your consciousness is able to go to that next level, and you're able to think about organizing, and I think you have a broader understanding of your own struggle. And I really feel within some of our newer immigrant communities, particularly South Asians, Arabs, West Africans, East Africans, even the Haitian community, although it's a little bit older, and it is better organized, than I think some of our other communities. But still, that's something that we really feel as an organization that we've been talking a lot about how do we find a way of supporting, the development of an immigrant rights consciousness within our communities, which a consciousness that is not mutually exclusive from a class consciousness, but if anything, actually, I think gives more clarity to a class consciousness, because you are here as an immigrant, as a worker, at the end of the day. And so the two are very much connected. But and I do think that it's one of the reasons why you have, in certain union movements where you have more Latino participation and more of a militant Latino membership. I really think part of that comes from not only the history of Latinos within the labor movement, but also the role that the immigrant rights movement has played in the Latino community, where the language is very much a class-conscious language as a whole. But in our communities, like in the Asian community, one, it's a lesser developed movement, and two, there's not yet a class-conscious language even within the movement that exists. And I think that, a lot of our organizations, we have to really find a way of really increasing the visibility and the presence of, immigrant rights consciousness within our community.
And I think one thing that's important is sort of organizing the South Asian communities and also the West African, all these other communities, in a way that sort of challenges all of these separate parts that we come in with. And that's to say that, we're a lot more diverse linguistically, culturally. We're not homogenous at all. And that's not to say that the Latino community here is, but, Latin America, South America, the unifying language there is Spanish, and they have, their challenges are not as extreme as ours, Here, you're not just West African, but you are West African of a specific country, and even within that, you are West African belonging to a specific group, and then a specific language group. So it's just so complex, and trying to get over those barriers to unify ourselves is just...
I always tell the people from LA they don't know anything about immigration until they come to Queens, New York.
They don't like your accent. Well, can we say that any final thoughts anybody wants to offer, or can we?
One thing I really find really interesting is that, and thank you all because this is really inspiring. I learned a lot tonight. One thing I think is really interesting is that expanding that notion of unionism to non-traditional sectors. I think one place to also start is also parent unions, considering what's going on with the shop in education, whether or not parents and students should be forming unions. Also thinking about prison unions, what's going on in Georgia right now, with the strike that's going on, But also really quickly, 1% of concern is also the report that's come out by Community Service Society about the African American males, 1 out of 4 not having a job. I'm wondering if it is any quick thoughts in terms of organizing unemployed people at this particular period of time, and what would be the starting point for that, for possible organizing around the unemployment question?
We have the model of the early 1930s, the role that the Communist Party and the Socialist Party played in various cities in organizing unemployed leagues and unemployed councils. I think that's a viable model. What it does is it does not make the distinction between employment and unemployment to define the working class, but creates a broad enough umbrella that says unemployed workers are workers. They're workers without jobs at the moment, and that one of the things that we need to fight for as a movement is full employment, and that's a term that's been sort of, completely washed away in popular Democratic Party discourse. So I think there is a space for, particularly given the deep structural unemployment that we're talking about now and what is likely to remain a very high rate of unemployment, that sort of introducing unemployed councils would be a very smart thing to do politically.
Yeah, real quickly, I mean, it is, oddly enough, Machinist Union took the initiative inside the AFL-CIO to demand the creation of some organization of the unemployed, which is starting to get some traction. What forms will be created out of it, I don't know yet, but I think there's one thing that seems to be taking hold is that people kind of get there's a need to have a movement that demands jobs. So I think that is one thing that we're beginning to see, some commitment and some resources will be put in that direction. Although it was interesting, for some strata this is a good moment. When I talk to the people who work at the Chinese Staff Workers Association, they're actually, in this last year or so, they've been saying, you know, we've been making some substantial gains. So I think it depends on where you are, what your strategy is, how you engage this moment. But yeah, in generally, I think we go back to jobs or income.
Right.
And I think that will get some traction, particularly in the Midwest. The CSS report, by the way, is a follow-up to a report that was done several years ago, which the Black, Latino, Asian Caucus of the City Council then put up $20 million of their own, because nobody else would,
Right.
for workforce development funds to go into these communities. Tish James has pockets of unemployment in her district among African American males as high as 70%. And if you talk to these council members, they know their districts. Unemployment is much worse among black males than anybody else, and people don't realize how bad it is. The CSS report gives you the numbers, but the numbers can't tell you the pain. It's just unbelievable what's going on out there. Yeah, I'm going to be impolite and book right after she's done, because I got to get out of here.
Yeah, we know.
Yeah, I think I need to, apologies for the coughing. The Jobs with Justice chapters around the country, actually, some of them have started to organize unemployed councils, and there's a emerging movement of organizations, particularly in the Midwest, of precariously employed workers that Barbara Ehrenreich has been writing a lot about. And so I do think that, again, where there's oppression, there will be organization and resistance. And I think that there's just so many people out there who are suffering, who want to be organized, and we just need to create the vehicles and the opportunities to really support that.
Thank you.